Welcome to the Real Baltimore. I'm your host, Jessel Noor. Baltimore is home to the nation's first residential segregation law. It was ground zero to redlining, blockbusting, and the subprime lending crisis. Deeply segregated to this day, more than half the city's renters can barely afford to pay their rent. And a recent Sun investigation detailed the challenges faced by those dealing with landlords who won't address hazardous living conditions. A rent court stacked against the poor and one of the highest eviction rates in the country. Here's a bit of what the Sun found.
A month after we moved in here, we started noticing stuff going wrong with the house. And as we started just looking at different stuff, we seen that not only did we have rat holes, we was without heat, of course. The furnace didn't work. A lot of appliances was not working, like the dishwasher doesn't work, our garbage disposal doesn't work. There's no weather stripping on the doors, so us mice can get in easy access into it. So that's what made us really go file and start opening up the rent escrow case.
Baltimore leaders created the nation's first housing court 70 years ago in response to the slum conditions spreading in the city. Rent court was supposed to foster safer, cleaner, and better housing in Baltimore. However, a year-long investigation by the Baltimore Sun found that the system works against tenants, while in many cases failing to hold landlords accountable for not meeting minimum housing standards.
I mean, we're moving in the middle of December, and Christmas is next week, so this is the toughest Christmas for our kids because of us having to move because of the living situations that we're in. So it's difficult, it's hard.
In general, I think that what tenants find is that rent escrow holds promise, but it's a promise unfulfilled. And ultimately the results of escrow don't really, they're not really what the tenant expected. They often end up moving out instead of staying in the property because the tension or the incomplete repairs become kind of the punctuation on this really long story, and it's just not satisfactory to a person who's honestly a consumer trying to hold a company accountable.
Well, today we're joined by our expert panel to discuss all of this, as well as what advocates hope is a new vision and direction for affordable housing in Baltimore. With our panel, Jean Marbella is a veteran reporter and member of the Baltimore Sun investigative team, co-authored the series Dismissed with Doug Donovan. She's been a national correspondent, columnist, and editor for over the course of 3 decades at the Sun. LaQeisha Greene is with United Workers. She's a leader there and a Harlem Park resident. Matt Hill is an attorney with the Public Justice Center, chairman of the Affordable Housing Roundtable's Policy Committee. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So Jean, you spent a year following families that are dealing with the affordable housing crisis, with hazardous living conditions, lead paint, mice infestations. Talk about what you found over this course of the year. Do we have a good system that holds landlords in check for abuses?
Yes, my co-author, Doug Donovan, and I spent a year looking at the rent court system, and we did both the human side and the data side. I think this is the first time that rent court data has been analyzed in the way that it has. We looked at 5 years worth of escrow cases in rent court to see what trends might have emerged. And we found some fairly disturbing things. I think landlords often will say, oh, there are people, these tenants, they use the system, they get behind in the rent, and so they file an escrow case saying, my roof is leaking, there are rats in the kitchen, that sort of thing. But we found that it was about 5,500 escrow cases that were filed over the past 5-some years. 6 out of 10 cases, housing inspectors verified the complaints. They found serious code violations that threatened the parlance's life, health, and safety of the tenants. And it was everything from flooded basements, leaky roofs, rats, roaches, you name it. So in 6 out of the every 10 cases, there would be these verified housing code violations. But in only 3 out of those cases, 3 out of 10 cases, was an escrow account even opened. So it's unclear what happened to those, the other 3 of 10 cases. Then we found that cases generally took about 100 days to resolve, even though the law recommends 30 days from the start of the complaints to the resolution. And then when the case is completed, we found that tenants generally did not get back as much of the rent they had paid into the accounts as the landlords did. So that was how we came to our conclusion that rent court tends to favor landlords at the expense of tenants.
So LaQeisha, you've moved more than 24 times over the course of 35 years. What kind of toll does that take on you and your family? What impact does that have?
It has the impact of, it's several impacts, in fact. There's the health impact of it, there's the stress that comes with it financially. You know, you have to deal with not being able to sometimes afford to move because you spent so much money into the escrow and then not being able to get that money back. I've been in those situations where, you know, I put in $1,000 into my escrow, but I'm only allowed to get maybe $300 of that back, you know, and then you're expected to move. You know, it puts a huge strain on a family, you know, such as mine, you know, where I'm a single parent. And I imagine that with anybody going through that situation, you know, it's hard. It's completely unjustified.
And so you've been working on this issue for some time now, and you've come to some of the same conclusions as the Sun found in some of your investigations, examinations of the rent court system. Talk about what you see as the primary issues with the system and how it currently works right now.
Sure. So we had a study called Justice Diverted in 2015 that looked more at the rent court, the failure to pay rent court side of the equation, and interviewed roughly 300 tenants, and found many of the same issues that Q and Jean were talking about in terms of tenants not really knowing what their rights are, and even when they did necessarily know what their rights were, that they had these problems with the property, these threats to life, health, and safety. Being unable to really effectively raise those issues in the rent court proceedings. There's a lot of repeat player advantages that landlords have in this process. They have agents who specialize in rent court proceedings, and they are known in the court and they know the law. Tenants really don't have access to either these agents or effectively some sort of effective counsel in most cases. A lot of landlords aren't even compliant with basic lead registration and lead certificates. That's a major problem in Baltimore City, in which we have such a high lead poisoning issue.
Yeah, our viewers will know that in previous shows it's documented. Hundreds of people get lead poisoned. Children get lead poisoned every year because of this issue, because there's just no accountability. There's not the staff or the manpower or the will to really hold landlords accountable that don't have, because Maryland has one of the strongest laws around this, but it's an issue of enforcement and really holding these landlords accountable.
That's right. I mean, there's a legal issue with that in terms of whether or not there's lack of clarity as to whether or not the landlord's complaint for eviction should even be dismissed if there's a problem with their lead certificate. We need to change that. With respect to licensing in the city, all multifamily landlords have to pass an annual health and safety inspection, but the single family or the duplexes, which are most rentals and also usually the worst conditions, don't have to pass an annual health and safety inspection. That's a major problem as well. Fundamentally, there are bigger problems, I think, in terms of the market for affordable housing and the lack of affordable housing and the lack of public investment in affordable housing. And so we think we need to reprioritize public investment instead of working on TIFs necessarily for luxury development, to really focus on how do we improve neighborhoods in decent, habitable, really affordable housing so that people aren't caught in the situation that Q was just talking about, where you're constantly being displaced in this kind of very profit-driven system where slumlords are just squeezing out as much profit as they can before they then abandon these properties to become yet another vacant.
So, Jean, you talked a little bit about how the response that landlords had to your reporting. Some of them said, there's professional tenants that use this system, they game it to their benefit. Some felt that the system actually favored tenants overall. Can you address those types of claims, and as well as can you kind of break down? There's two systems in rent court. There's the rent court, and then there's the escrow, which we were talking about. Explain how that works.
Yeah. The rent court is basically two parts. One is generated by landlord complaints, and the other one is generated by tenant complaints. And by far, the landlord complaints are, 150,000 cases a year versus escrow cases, which are about 1,000 or so. But landlord cases generally are failure to pay rent cases. And landlords have complained that the system moves very slowly. You're allowed to file a failure to pay rent case within days of the rent being late, but tenants are given a lot of time to sort of catch up. The way the eviction law is written, you can pay up until the point the sheriff is knocking on your door. You can pay what you owe and stop the eviction. So that's where a lot of the landlord complaints come from. They say, well, it's sort of like check kiting. You pay everything that you have to pay, and the rent is the last thing that gets paid, because you know that by the time the landlord goes to court, gets a judgment, gets a right of possession order, and the sheriff schedules the eviction, you kind of can stretch the process out. So that's where a vast majority of the landlord complaints come from. Now, on the other side of rent court, it's the escrow court. That's where a tenant who has complaints about the conditions of their housing can go and file a complaint against their landlord, and the judge can open an escrow account where the tenant can pay their rent into that account rather than to the landlord, as a way of compelling the landlord to make repairs. Now that court is not, the delays there mainly come from the need for a housing inspector to go to the apartment or the house to check and verify whether the complaints are indeed valid. And then the landlord is given a certain chunk of time to fix it, and then another inspection has to be scheduled to verify that the landlord has done what he or she has said they have done. So that, that case, as I mentioned earlier, we found that on average it takes 3 months to resolve things. And generally, tenants don't run to escrow court the minute the roof starts leaking. So they might have been living with the problem for months before they even started the process. So in many cases, I found one tenant who, her escrow case lasted about 1.5 years. And it was crazy. It was just, there was no lead certificate, the porch was falling down, the basement was flooding, there were roaches, and this went on for about 1.5 years, and finally she just gave up. The judge kept, citing the landlord for contempt of court for not showing up, but there's only so much you can do. You can't snatch someone off the street and, make them appear in court. And so I think that's a typical outcome in many respects, that people just get tired. You have work, you have childcare to deal with. Who has time to be an advocate for yourself?
And as we mentioned, the system is inherently unfair because you have low-income tenants that don't have a right to counsel. They have to provide their own, and they have to have a lawyer. They can't have someone else represent them.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the landlords have, unlimited resources in comparison.
Property agents who aren't lawyers but are allowed to represent them in court. I think that that's one of the surprising things about rent court. I think people you see police procedurals, crime dramas on TV, and everyone knows if you're arrested for a crime, you have a right to an attorney. But here in rent court, where the penalty could be just as severe, you could land on the sidewalk, you could lose your house, you and your family could be homeless, at the drop of a hat, and yet there's no right to counsel.
And one of the quotes in your piece is that stuck with me is that you interviewed a professor, I believe, who said not only are people in poverty experiencing this, but this cycle also creates poverty. It perpetuates the overall cycle of poverty. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was from Matthew Desmond, who's a sociologist at Harvard, and he wrote the great book, Evicted, which has won every prize in the past year, deservedly so. And he's probably called attention to the issue more than anyone, in recent times. And what happens is, it's a cliche, but it turns out to be true. It's really expensive to be poor. I followed a woman who was in a homeless shelter for 7-some months, and a program found a house for her. But the house was just about as expensive as the benefits that she said she was getting. There was some dispute as to whether she had more benefits than she initially was saying. But in any event, basically her entire benefit check went to rent. So that obviously is not sustainable. And at a certain point, she was getting housing assistance, but that's, it starts with 100% of the rent is paid, and then 75% of the rent is paid. Then eventually the client is expected to pay the full ride. But at a certain point, she just couldn't afford it anymore, and so she got behind in the rent. And so the late fees started to creep up. She was about 3 months behind in rent, and finally she got evicted. Well, that didn't solve the problem for her, because then she had to find a storage unit to put her stuff in. She had to find a hotel to put her family in. She didn't have a car, so she had to find a guy with a truck to move her stuff. And it was just this cascade of bills that it's just really hard to claw out of. Once, the hole just gets deeper and deeper.
Talk about, so you moved more than 24 times. Talk about some of the stuff that you've had to deal with and some of the landlords, I guess slumlords you can call them,
yes,
that you've had to go up against.
Yes. I can relate to pretty much everything you've been saying here. Like, I've been in court where the agent for my landlord basically made the argument to the judge that, oh, she's too knowledgeable of what goes on in the rent court, and she's using that to her advantage in order to get over on the landlord. And
can't believe you would do that.
Exactly. And I'm like, at that point in time, I'm saying it was in the lease that this is what you're supposed to do and what you're and they wouldn't enforce it. I couldn't get the judge to just simply enforce it. You get to the point, like you were saying, I was on public housing lists for 8 years, and then you get there and you try to keep things at your pace, but then they have all the repairs that need to be done. And you go to rent court and they tell you, oh, well, when it's time for your lease to be renewed, no, we don't want you to stay here because you've been late on your rent too many times. And that's a reason to evict you. And it becomes just this whole cycle, like you said, where you're constantly trying to dig yourself out of a hole just to get into a place to live. I've been to the point where I had a landlord. She used the fact that she was a doctor as her standing as to discredit me, when I had a housing inspector tell the judge, there was no running water in the house. The house was, I had a case of guarantee of habitability against her. And because I found out 10 days moving in that the pipes in the house had busted from the 3rd floor all the way down to the basement.
Because oftentimes, and as you've documented, I'm sure you've seen, houses might look fine when you move in. It might look and smell might feel good.
Yeah.
But then soon after you move in, the
You
heat
start
stops
seeing
working.
the problem.
You start noticing.
Absolutely. When I came to see it, all I could smell was the paint, basically. But then as you move in, you started to smell the mildew and the mold and everything, and that's when you find the rat holes, and you find out why the panel underneath the sink is there, because there's a big gaping hole. There's so many surface things that you don't find until you move in and you've already signed the lease. And now, within the law tells you, well, if you do within 30 days, you have the right to ask for your money back and everything. They can let you out, but they don't want to let you out. They make you go to court, knowing that when you go to court, it's going to basically run in their favor in the long run anyway. So it's such a battle, such a battle, I tell you. I've lost more money.
And I wanted to ask you,
in.
what impact has it had? You're a mother.
Yes.
And so what impact has it had on your
On my children.
And because they've had to move schools, I imagine, change neighborhoods, change friends, change
Yes.
relationships. Like that's
Like one of the things, like my son, we've been to so many different neighborhoods. Like there was never any real time for him to actually make friends. And when he has made friends, it's hard when children, once you move to another area, because you're going from, well, at this point you're in West Baltimore, but then when you move, you have to go all the way to Southeast Baltimore. As kids, you can't see your friends anymore, because they're not in the neighborhood, you're not there. So it's really hard. And then on top of having to make new friends in another school, it's extremely hard for them. My daughter herself, she's had to deal with the fact of, being separated because of the fact I said, well, look, I don't have a stable place for us. So she had to go and stay with her grandmother and her father for a while. That's separation, separates families. You go through all of those things. And then there was one point in time I was living in a shelter and there was an issue came up, and then CPS got involved. And the issue,
Child
Protective Services, and with their issues for not giving me back my custody was, oh, you don't have a house to live in. Well, I have my offer from the city. Well, but you don't have your kids, so we can't give you this offer now. So it puts you in a catch-22 situation where you're penalized because you don't have a place to stay. And now there's so many. I've ran into so many different people that have had this same situation because I'm living in a shelter. Now I no longer are able to take care of my kids. I no longer have custody of my children. Because the state wants to say that. Someone, because it's not really the state, but there's just those things that come along that say, you're not really stable, so we don't think that you can really take care of your kids. Well, if the system was more stable and supportive for me, then I would have a place to keep my kids. Those are the tolls that it's taken on me.
And Matt, can you talk about the scope of this problem? Because we've, as I mentioned, a huge amount of people in Baltimore. Many are low income, many are African American, many are women that have to deal with this. I know they opened up the list for Section 8 public housing a few years ago, and something like a tenth of the population tried to get on that list. In a city of 600,000, more than 60,000 people tried to sign up, and only a fraction of them are going to get on there.
Yep. That's absolutely right. I mean, the scope is huge. I mean, there are about 220,000 renter households in the city, and as Jean mentioned, we have 150,000 rent complaints each year. There's different statistics you can use to measure the scope of the affordability problem, but it's massive. I mean, we're not advocating that everyone gets a free house here. This is about people having affordable housing, so paying a third of their income toward the rent, giving them money to pay for necessary school supplies, getting to work. And I think, Q's, describing what happened to her really just reminded me about how important and foundational housing is. Having that kind of habitable, affordable house allows you to retain your children, allows you to get a job, allows your kids to go to a steady school and get a good education. Without housing, that kind of foundation, you're not able to really do all the other things that are going to make your life very more meaningful and able to thrive in the environment that you're in.
Yeah, and in a city that has a record homicide rate this year, people are looking for answers. How do we stabilize this? How do we secure communities? This is obviously a place we have to start in the city. And I wanted to end our first segment with you because from your reporting, you found the the biggest recipient of complaints was actually the City Housing Authority.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that surprised us. We thought it would be one of the private management firms, but the HABC, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, came out on top, and it's not a distinction you necessarily would want. And I think it speaks to housing in general in Baltimore. The housing stock is old, it's crumbling, and it seems to get worse every year. You know, you look at the vacants problem. All those at one point were residences. And so what you realize is that there's very little decent housing at the lower end of the scale. You know, if you can afford Harbor East, if you can afford the upcoming Port Covington, you can have a really nice apartment. But for most people, the poor, the working poor, there's just very little housing available, and everyone's competing for the same good apartments at a certain income level. And the eviction problem and the rent court problem kind of exacerbates it, because once you have an eviction on your record, landlords are reluctant to rent to you. So you get stuck with the worst housing, whereas people with a clean record get the better housing. So the system just kind of self-perpetrates.
All right, well, that wraps up the first part of our discussion, and we're going to get into solutions and what some demands to fix this system are going to look like in a second. But I want to thank Jean Marbella. She co-authored this really powerful and infuriating series on rent court. LaQeisha Greene, you've been evicted and moved more than 24 times in 35 years. And Matt Hill with the Public Justice Law Center. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us at The Real News.